welcome to tonight's forum and panel discussion, the Vigil After Dover. My name is Deborah Blum. I will be moderating this event. And I'd like to begin with some special thanks and a couple of announcements. We owe a debt of gratitude to our sponsors, the Florida State University Office of Research and the University Research Magazine Association, in conjunction with the Tallahassee Scientific Society in celebration of IRMA, that's the University Research Magazine Association's 25th anniversary conference, being held this week at Florida State. We welcome IRMA members representing 42 institutions from the University of Saskatchewan to the University of Puerto Rico. For those of you who are arriving late, there is an overflow room for this meeting. It's room 1200. There are people outside this room who can direct you there. For those of you in this room and that room, the last half hour of this meeting is dedicated to questions from the audience. We have microphones at the back of these two aisles so that if you want to ask a question, you need to go to those microphones in order to be recorded, in order to be part of the webcast, and in order to be heard in the overflow room. For anyone who's in the overflow room now listening to me, if you think of a question you want to ask, at that point you should come to this room and line up at one of the microphones. With that, I'm going to introduce our very distinguished panel, give a brief statement of introductions. This particular forum is designed something along a Science Friday type format. That is, it is unrehearsed. I will be asking our panelists questions, and they will spontaneously come up with brilliant answers, or be booted off the panel. And
American Idol.
Right. We'll be voting intermittently. But I'm going to begin by introducing them from my left here and just going down. John Haught is a distinguished research professor at Georgetown University, an internationally known theologian and expert on topics related to science, theology, and ecology. He is the author of God After Darwin, A Theology of Evolution, Science and Religion, From Conflict to Conversion, Mystery and Promise, A Theology of Revelation. Eugenie Scott is the executive director of the National Center for Science Education in Berkeley, California, a nationally acclaimed activist organization in the favor of teaching evolution in the nation's science curriculum. She received her PhD in physical anthropology from the University of Missouri and has worked as both a researcher and an activist for more than two decades. Everyone from the American Humanist Association to the National Science Board has honored her work, supporting not only the teaching of evolutionary theory, but the raising of standards of science education.
This is definitely our crowd.
Now I've lost my next thing. Robert Panek, who I've just managed to scramble up my introductions here. Robert Panek is a professor of philosophy and engineering and computer science at Michigan State University. He is a widely known philosopher of science. He does experiments with digital evolution. And he was an expert at the court case in question, Kitzmiller versus the Dover School Board. Who's next? Dean Travis. Dean Joseph Travis is Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Florida State University and the Robert O. Lawton Distinguished Research Professor in the Department of Biological Science. He is an evolutionary biologist and studies the ways in which natural selection plays a role in shaping the size, the life history, and the sexual behavior of a wide variety of species. Michael Roos is a professor of philosophy, and like everyone on this panel, really, one of the country's leading scholars in exploring the connections and disconnections between science and religion. He is a fellow of both the Royal Society of Canada and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He was instrumental in the 1980s creation science trials in helping the courts define or establish a definition for science. He is the author of last year's The Evolution Creation Struggle and of a book to be published in July, Darwinism and Its Discontents. And I should mention that he and Dean Travis are collaborating on the Harvard Companion to Evolution, which they've promised me will be out next year, or which we hope will be out next year. And finally, last but not least, Professor Stephen Guy is the David and Deborah Fonvielle and Donald and Janet Hinkle Professor of Law at Florida State's College of Law, considered one of the country's leading scholars on religious liberties and free speech. He is the author of the casebook, Cases and Materials on Religion and State. He teaches a church and state seminar, constitutional law, and a First Amendment seminar. Before joining the Florida State faculty, he was associated with the firm of Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison in New York City. He received his JD from Columbia University and was editor of the Columbia Law Review. And I hope you'll join me in welcoming a very distinguished panel. I'd like to begin with a quote, actually. It is so easy to hide our ignorance under such expressions as the plan of creation, unity of design, etc., and to think we give an explanation. The day will come when this will be seen as a curious illustration of the blindness of preconceived opinion. The person making that statement was Charles Darwin. In 1859, in the first edition of On the Origin of Species. And although the focus of our panel tonight is obviously a little more recent, I thought I would begin, as they say, in the beginning. Almost 150 years have passed since Darwin first proposed his revolutionary theory. And yet, the questions, the struggles, the difficulties that we face are remarkably reflective of those raised in the mid-19th century. We pose the same challenges to critics of the theory. We dismiss the theory as being able to only describe the tangible world, unable to enlighten us as to the intangible one. Science has advanced beyond measure since Darwin and his colleague Alfred Russel Wallace first put forth that controversial theory. They proposed evolution at a time before the science of genetics had been developed, the structure of DNA elucidated, the studies of RNA begun, fields like epigenetics had not yet exploded into excitement, and yet none of this has left Darwin behind. His work stands as a cornerstone of modern biology. In a time when science claims enormous power over our lives, from medicine to meteorology, it seems entirely logical that it must be taught well, and that it cannot be taught well without teaching its fundamentals, including Darwinian evolution. And yet we don't always make our decisions according to logic. It's worth noting that within 10 years of the publication of On the Origin, Alfred Russel Wallace, whose independent study of the theory of natural selection was the catalyst for Darwin's publication, had decided that mechanical evolution was not enough, that it could not adequately explain human intellectual development or address questions essential to moral development. Wallace proposed that an intelligent designer might be required for those aspects of evolution. In 1868, Darwin wrote to Wallace, warning him that he was doing nothing but harm to their joint endeavor. "You write like a retrograde naturalist," he said. "I defy you to deny your own theory." It's the balance of fact and faith, physics and metaphysics, that yet confounds us. Again and again, since the days of Darwin and Wallace, we've struggled, not only always successfully, to resolve that conflict. So we get Kitzmiller versus the Dover School Board last fall in Pennsylvania, a lawsuit provoked by officials who sought to require that intelligent design, the suggestion that nature is too complex to have occurred only through random evolution, be part of the science curriculum. The trial had a curious sense of deja vu, a kinship to the 1925 Scopes trial, the 1987 Supreme Court decision against teaching creationism in the school, and a host of less well-publicized rulings, such as the recent court decision in Georgia against allowing anti-evolutionary theory stickers to be pasted on textbooks. In the Dover case, which is the focus of or at least the launching point for our discussion tonight, U.S. District Court Judge John Jones issued a ruling saying in small part that the trial had yielded overwhelming evidence that intelligent design is a religious view and not a scientific theory, and was therefore unconstitutional, a clear violation of separation of church and state. Dover has been hailed as a setback for advocacy groups seeking to weaken the teaching of evolutionary theory and, by implication, the teaching of science, but a setback only. There are still more than a dozen states openly considering ways to integrate intelligent design into the curriculum, or at least to demand that Darwinian natural selection be taught as a deeply flawed theory, lacking in key aspects. To say that God did not play a role is arrogant, explains William Harris, a professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City Medical School. It's far beyond the data. And that's really why we're here today, having assembled what I think is one of the best national caliber panels on the issue since the Dover decision itself. We're here in the shadow of a difficult history to assess the present in the light of these most recent decisions and to look to the future. The notion of a vigil after Dover suggests we should be watchful and wary, and to my mind, that there is no way to maintain watch without illuminating the shadows that surround us in this area. So with that, I'm going to begin to address my questions to the panel. Dr. Scott, I'm curious as to your assessment of the Dover decision in this way. Your center not only tracked that, but monitors intelligent design activities around the country. Do you believe that this decision has affected other states?
Oh yeah, there's no question that Kitzmiller versus Dover definitely threw sand in the gears of efforts to get policies like Dover's requiring the teaching of intelligent design to be passed. Of course, the Discovery Institute, which is the major think tank for intelligent design, did not want the Dover policy and tried to get the Dover School Board to change the wording so that it would be more bulletproof legally, and failed. And for a number of years, they've understood that intelligent design is legally vulnerable, because any judge is going to ask, who is the designer? And it'll become very obvious that the designer is God, and you just can't say God did it as part of a science class in the public schools. So intelligent design isn't going to work legally. What I think is going to happen, what we've seen happening, and what we predict more of in the future, is the current strategy of the Discovery Institute, which is not to say teach evolution and balance it with intelligent design, but teach evolution and balance it with evidence against evolution. The bad science that Deborah was talking about. That appears to be less legally vulnerable, and depending on who your judge is, it might be less legally vulnerable. But one of the things that many people don't notice or didn't notice about Kitzmiller versus Dover is that not only was intelligent design struck down by this judge, but also the evidence against evolution approach. He did address that in the decision, which you can read on our webpage, and I would encourage you to do so, because it's a very, very well-written and understandable decision. So I'm hoping that Kitzmiller will throw sand in the gears both of intelligent design as well as the evidence against evolution approach.
Professor Pennock, you were a witness in the trial. Did you see yourself this sending from a very small school district in Pennsylvania a national message about what is science and what is not?
This was a trial that from the beginning, I think everyone recognized had national import. It was covered nationally, it was covered internationally. I mean, this was a big, big story. It's often the case that the turning place on which these big stories happen is a little a little town. The Scopes trial occurred in a little town, right? And big ideas can sort of be shown there. The Intelligent Design Group may not have wanted this to be the particular place, but they had wanted some court case, and they had been looking from the very beginning. The whole strategy had been crafted to try to get around the problems that the earlier strategy of creation science had stumbled into. It was clearly a religious view, and they thought that they had a strategy that would stand up in court. And they were almost cocky about it beforehand. One of the main intelligent design leaders, William Dembski, sort of boasted that should it ever come to trial, he would bet a bottle of single malt scotch that it would stand up against the constitutional test. And he owes us a bottle of scotch now.
And he hasn't delivered.
He hasn't yet delivered on that either.
Actually, you raise a point that I think is an interesting one, and it certainly was true in Dayton, Tennessee, although there were a lot of complicated reasons for Dayton, Tennessee. Do you see this as being driven more by small rural districts than urban districts? If you looked at El Tejon, California, or some of the other school districts, do you see the drive toward intelligent design being an urban versus rural kind of effect, in the same way that some have argued is the real story rather than red state, blue state, urban versus rural politically?
Yeah. For years, I've been saying this, that it's not so much a demographic, it's not so much a regional problem. The creation and evolution issue is really a demographic problem. It occurs in suburbs and small towns rather than in big cities. You're not going to see it in Atlanta, but you can see it in Cobb County. And the reason for this, I think, is because you have to realize how incredibly politicized education is in the United States. Unusually so. This is not the case in other developed countries. But our school system is decentralized, and it's run by these elected school boards. And elected school boards, notice the emphasis there, are looking over their shoulder to see who's voting. And so that politicizes education here much more so than any other country. So what happens is, because you're dealing with politics, large cities which are very heterogeneous and have a lot of different entities vying for some sort of authority or power in the community basically swamp religious conservatives. They're only one voice in many, and they never get the upper hand. Suburbs, small towns are smaller and more homogeneous just by nature. Where that homogeneity is religiously conservative, that's where you're likely to find creation and evolution issues. You're not going to find it in Berkeley, California, where I come from. But you can
Except
find...
for Philip Johnson.
Well, yeah, there we have Phil. But he's not going to influence the school board, and that's the issue. But you don't have to go very far outside of the Bay Area into the Central Valley of California to find these issues cropping up, and it's because of the homogeneity and religious conservatism of these smaller communities. And the South and the Midwest are chock full of small towns, which is why we tend to have more problems there than we have, say, in New England.
Do you agree with that, Professor Haught? Do you see a complicated theology in this country? I mean, we tend to say religious right as if it's a monolithic thing. Do you see this being driven by small town rural conservatism, say, versus?
Well, I'm not an expert in the demographics of it, but that certainly seems to me to be the case, that's happening.
And did you, when you assessed the Dover decision, see anything that might predict a change in the way we try to balance these issues? Anything that looked like something that theologians could wrestle with and move forward on?
Well, I see the whole issue as a problem that arises partly from inadequate science education in this country, mixed with inadequate religious education. And when you put the two together, it's a rather noxious mixture. So this is only the beginning. I hope that it excites people enough to start thinking about just exactly what science is And that's a major problem, what scientific explanation consists of, what the limits of science are. And before we can have a meaningful discussion of the relationship between science and religion, we have to do what the medieval philosophers said. We have to distinguish in order to relate. And much of the conversation on this issue, it seems to me, betrays a kind of conflation of all explanation into one explanatory slot. And if science is filling that slot for some people, then there's no room for theology or religion. If religion fills that explanatory slot, then there's no room for science. So to me, what needs to be done is to develop a taste for what I would call layered explanation, by which I mean that almost everything in our experience admits of a plurality of levels of understanding and levels of explanation. And that would be a starting point. I won't develop that now, but that's where I would start.
But I would like you to explore one point you raised slightly more in depth, and that's the idea of an adequate religious education. How would you define that, and how, in our society, given the restrictions of teaching religion, really, would you facilitate that?
Well, I think in the Catholic schools, for example, we learn very early not to take the scriptures with scientific, literal presuppositions. And that's something that I think is going on in the mainline churches all over the country, but it's not going on everywhere. For many people, the whole story of the meaning of their existence is something that's deeply connected to a scriptural text. I've seen this not just in our country, but elsewhere. I just came back from a trip to Iran, and there, much more than in our country, the meaning, significance of everything is tied to a holy book. So, and I don't know how long it will take for the Muslim world to come to grips with evolution, but I think a first step in all of this is to develop a kind of taste for interpreting holy books in which you seek depth and meaning, and not necessarily something that you can map clearly and directly onto a scientific picture of things. We have to learn to distinguish different levels of interpretation.